waiting for the slides to get on the screen, and then we're very good to start. Okay, so here we can start. So welcome again to this session on the sustainability and the resilience of cities in the climate crisis and during the COVID pandemic. We will have two speakers today. First, Mr. Lukas Lingenthal, who's a policy advisor at the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Germany, and then Mr. Ashok Sridharan, who's the former mayor of Bonn and the former president of ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, and now practices as a lawyer in Bonn. Mr. Lingenthal, can I give you the floor for welcoming remarks, please?
Thank you very much, Leon, and thank you very much for all you being here. Konrad Adenauer Foundation is a German political foundation emphasizing education, international dialogue, and political consulting. One of our goals is to enable people to take responsibility for society by getting engaged. And one of these levels of engagement is the municipal level. Cities and municipalities take a key role in organizing public welfare because they are the administrative level that is closest to the inhabitants. Thus, they also take a key role in organizing sustainability and resilience, and getting concepts into action that result in sustainable development. In this study project, which will be presented now, we wanted to take a closer look on the role that cities are playing in sustainable development and the implementation of the 2030 agenda. And we wanted to know what cities can do in urban planning to respond to the climate change and sudden shocks as the COVID pandemic. Therefore, we work together with ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability, and Mr. Ashok Sridharan, former mayor of the city of Bonn, who is author of the study and who will present the results now. Very pleased to be here with you, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Leon, and thank you, Lukas, for the introduction, and a very warm welcome from my side as well. I really appreciate that you found a way to room 2 of the Action Zone and that you're interested in the outcomes of this project. The project's name is called the Sustainability and Resilience of Cities in the Climate Crisis and during the COVID pandemic, and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation invited me to do this project and laid the management of this project in my hands. I would like to flip through the agenda. First of all, I want to introduce the project to you, then followed by thesis, then we will talk about, or I will talk about sustainability and resilience, describe the situation, especially during the pandemic, and because regarding the climate change, and with the conclusions. Globally, cities are playing a central role in sustainability development and the implementation of the 2030 agenda in general and SDG 11 in particular. And today is the day of the cities at the COP26 here in Glasgow. So I think the presentation is exactly at the correct day. And I want to especially thank to the Executive Secretary of the UNFCCC, who enabled me to present the outcomes of this project here today. So thanks a lot to Patricia Espinosa. At the same time, there still exists great but unutilized potential everywhere in the world when it comes to sustainable city development. That's why we wanted to have a closer look on how the cities around the globe managed the pandemic and also the climate change. And as a sudden shock, Lukas just mentioned it, COVID-19 pandemic has revealed the current city development's weak points and has shown once more that future city development not only has to provide solutions to the implications of urbanization, globalization and climate change, but also has to include unexpected and sudden events in its planning. Besides a sustainable direction of cities, considering the increase in sudden shocks, this project deals with resilient cities in particular, and of course, in particular with SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities. And I've been to one of the cities participating in this project, to La Paz, a couple of years ago. And of course, we discussed the possibilities of SDG 11 and the actions to be taken in La Paz, together with the former mayor of La Paz, who you can see on this photo. Let me introduce the participating organizations. It's first of all Konrad Adenauer Foundation. Lucas has told you what the Konrad Adenauer Foundation is doing and what they are focusing on. But the second organization is IGLE, Local Governments for Sustainability. And I want to say a special thank also to IGLE, and especially Leon, who is sitting to my left. He was a very big support, but not only Leon, also Dr. Nazmul Hook, who is not able to be here today, but he asked me to convey his best wishes and regards to all of you. And myself, I'm working for a law firm with offices in Bonn, Berlin, and in Leipzig in Germany, and I'm dealing with public law and with sustainability and resilience matters, and also doing advising public-private partnerships in this law firm, especially in the field of sustainability and resilience. We invited a couple of persons to participate in this project, and these persons came from the cities you see on this slide. There were 4 cities in South America. It is La Paz, it is Lima, Pergamino, and Recife. There are 2 cities in Africa, which is Cape Town and Quelimane. 1 city in Israel, which is Netanya, and 4 cities in India. In Asia, starting with Chennai from India. In India, Quezon City, Seoul in Singapore, and last but definitely not least, it's Melbourne City in Australia. And especially, I'm especially happy that Chennai was part of this project. A person of Chennai was part of this project because my father comes from Chennai, and Chennai, there is a relationship between Bonn, where I come from, and Chennai, and that's why there's a Bonn Avenue and a Madras Avenue, because Chennai was known as a city of Madras since a couple of years ago. How did we organize this project? We first, of course, invited the participants to be part of this project, and all of them got a questionnaire, really intense questionnaire, and I did interviews with all the participants from the 12 cities around the globe. And based on these interviews, I am presenting, of course, the outcomes of the project here at the COP. And end of November at Strong Cities 2030 network of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation. I don't know, Lucas, whether it will be online for other participants as well, or just for the participants of the Strong Cities 2030, but maybe you can add some information at the end of the presentation to this point. And I want to emphasize that the experts are not representatives of the city they are living in, because we wanted to lay a focus on people who are engaged in sustainability and resilience matters, and who just describe how they, what experience did they make during the pandemic and during the climate change. So let me move to the thesis, and I think the pandemic raised awareness of sustainability and resilience, especially in the global south. The most vulnerable people are identical in the pandemic and in the climate crisis. Healthcare has to be part of the sustainability and resilience strategy, and urban planning has to be holistic and integrate the aspects of future pandemics, sustainability and resilience. I will come back to these points later on in the presentation. So let's go on with sustainability. Sustainability requires a holistic thinking. It's not only to reduce emissions or empower renewables or improve the waste management, but it's also healthcare. And that's what we have learned in the pandemic especially, and also the availability of water and food is of highest importance from a city's perspective and from the people who are living in these cities. Another challenge is to provide housing for all the people, especially in vulnerable, extremely vulnerable areas of the cities. And we do need sufficient infrastructure, not only in the middle of the city, in the CBDs, in the center of the cities, but also in the neighborhoods. There has to be an infrastructure, for example, for fire workers, for medical care. So we do need hospitals, and as we've learned in the pandemic, we also need testing centers and vaccination centers. And all this has to be part of urban planning in the future. There are, of course, a lot of cities who are thinking about these holistic things right now. But I think the pandemic had made clear, and one of the lessons learned in the pandemic is that we do have to have this infrastructure in the neighborhoods as well, not only in the city centers. We are talking about these things for a couple of years now. We started in Rio de Janeiro in the 90s, early 90s, and we had several COPs. This is a photo taken from COP23, which took place under the presidency of Fiji in the city of Bonn. And it was a big challenge, of course, to host such a big conference, but I think the same challenges are here in Glasgow as well. And I think it is very important that we have the opportunity to exchange thoughts, to exchange ideas, and to learn from each other how to manage such crises as we are facing with the pandemic and the climate change. But let's move on to resilience. Of course, if we think about resilience, we think about buildings and we think about infrastructure, but we have to think about other things as well, because resilience means much more. And so we do not have to stay just with a first glance at buildings and infrastructure, but we have to consider regarding the resilience also healthcare. It's a lesson learned in the pandemic, but it's also a lesson learned in during the climate change, because many diseases refer to the climate change, and that's why healthcare is not only important in the pandemic situation, but also important facing the climate change. So is biodiversity. I think all of you do have an impression what climate change does to our biodiversity, and we have to do this. And I've just learned yesterday when I met Nikolai and Maria that there were lots of trees planted yesterday here in Glasgow with kids from schools, and I think this is very important, and I thank you very much and the Thermo Group for the initiative to do this here in Glasgow during COP26. Mitigation and adaptation are topics which are discussed on every conference, not only at the COP26 and on the COPs in the last years and in the Climate Week in New York, but we have to emphasize on mitigation and adaptation to be more resilient, not only concerning our buildings and infrastructure, but also concerning ourselves and the people we are responsible for. And digitalization is very important as well, because we have learned during the pandemic, when all the schools were closed and we had to work at home and to have our children at home to attend the online lessons from school, that in many of the cities I've talked to, there was not a sufficient infrastructure for digital lessons, for digital classes, and also for home office. And that's why I think it's part of a resilient city to be digital, able to have home office and homeschooling and all the other things which are needed when you are not allowed to leave your home, or not allowed to go to school, or not allowed to go to office. Let me describe the situation of the cities, and in the cities I've talked to who are part of the project, or the persons in the cities who are part of the project. 3 out of the 12 cities have a population density of more than 15,000 inhabitants. And I think from a German perspective, this is really incredible because in Germany we do have a density of population, it's between 250 and 300. And if you are dealing and talking to people from cities with a density of more than 15,000 inhabitants, there are much bigger challenges and entirely different challenges as we have them in Germany. 4 cities of the project have poverty rates of more than 25%, with a maximum of these 12 cities of 73%, which is really incredible, and 3 cities with more than 30% of the inhabitants living in informal settlements, up to 92%, which was a city in Africa. In all of the cities, health and education were most affected during the pandemic, especially, but also health was affected during the climate, and is affected during the climate change. And the primary sectors for action taken in these cities are livelihood, transport and mobility, and climate action. A good example for transport, new ideas of transport, is again in La Paz. They do have an aerial railway connecting the lower parts of the city, and many of you will know that La Paz is on 3,500 to 4,000 meters in the Andes, and that's why it's a big challenge to get a connection, a mobility connection between the lower parts of the city and the higher parts of the city. And the airport, for example, of La Paz is not in La Paz itself, it's in Palo Alto, which is a bit higher even than La Paz. And so it is an idea of getting new means of transport. And my hometown, Bonn, we started a project of an aerial railway as well a couple of years ago. And now, just this week, or no, last week, we got the permission of the federal government and of the state government of North Rhine-Westphalia to build an aerial railway in Bonn, and it will be financed by the federal government and the state government in North Rhine-Westphalia. During the pandemic, we all made the experience in our cities that we are not really prepared to face these challenges. There was one city I've talked to, Singapore. They were prepared because a couple of years ago they were affected by the SARS virus as well. And during the SARS virus a couple of years ago, they started to evaluate a strategy how to handle, how to manage a pandemic when it will come back. And that's why Singapore was very well prepared and had a strategy how to deal with the pandemic. But all the other cities, they were as surprised as we were in Germany with the pandemic. And that's why all the cities had to look for human resources to manage the pandemic, and also for financial resources to manage all the things which have to be managed. And the most impacts, the heaviest impacts, were of course health and education, but also livelihood, because many of the people lost their jobs. Many small, especially small and medium-sized companies had to close because of the pandemic. transport and mobility was a big challenge, and also the availability of public parks became much more important than before, because many of the people living in cities, they do not have an own garden. There is no urban gardening or something like that. So for recreation and to get some fresh air, they have to go to parks, because there's no other possibility. And that's why in many of the cities the need of public parks became much more aware than it was before. That's why the actions taken in many of the cities I've talked to is, of course, the healthcare. The need of new hospitals was very urgent, and the existing hospitals didn't have the capacity to take care of all the people who needed medical care. There was not enough oxygen. For example, in my father's hometown in Chennai, many people died because they didn't have enough oxygen to provide them with the things they needed. We all know that the vaccination was a big challenge to get all the vaccines around the globe, and it is still in some parts of the world a big challenge. And online services were not available in an extent which is sufficient to deal and to take care of all the needs people have when they are at home. The livelihood, I mentioned it already before, was also affected because food, water, and also social aid was not available in the neighborhoods where it was needed, but only in the centers of the city. And that's why the supply with food and water was a big challenge in many of the cities. And I would like to mention Lima, for example. They set up a program which was called Lima Takes Care of You. And they provided food and water, fresh food and also tin food and water in the neighborhoods. They brought it there with lorries and other mobility advisors and provided really the most needed food and water for the people living there, especially in the vulnerable areas. Transport and mobility was a big issue as well, and that's why many cities improved their bike lane infrastructure, they improved their public transport system, and they had to take care that the buses and trams and trains are not overcrowded. So in the trains and buses themselves, it was not such a big problem, but at the stations, the people were queuing up and they were waiting for the next buses. And so these were the most dangerous areas in some of the cities. And nowadays they take care and they are working on new mobility systems like aerial railways, for example, but also on more bus stations and more railway stations that the people do have more possibilities to get in and off the tram and the bus. Education, of course, was a very big challenge, and especially in the global south, it was a very big challenge with the with the infrastructure which was not there. And it was not only the digital IT infrastructure, but it was also the hardware. Because many of the kids in school, they do not have the possibility to have a tablet or a personal computer or laptop at home. So they had to get their classes via TV or via radio. And so the radio stations and the broadcasting stations in these countries, they were very important, and they supplied the classes for the kids, and but also for home office infrastructure, there was a need for digitalization, and that's why this is also a very important issue during the pandemic. And actions were taken also with the support of the private sector. In many of the cities themselves would not have been able to finance these infrastructure, to finance the tablets or personal computers or laptops for the people who needed them, and that's why they were how to say it? They had to have. They needed the support of the private sector. And one point which was a surprise to me living in Germany was that the waste management in many of the cities collapsed during the pandemic because the waste management took care of the hospitals first to get all the waste from the vaccines and from the infected people away from the hospitals, and that's why in the neighborhoods they were not able to collect the waste, which was a challenge in some of the cities taking part in this project. The lessons learned during the pandemic was that the DRR, the disaster risk reduction, did work and resources were made available in all of the cities. They just didn't do any other projects which were not as urgent as facing the pandemic, and that's why they focused on the pandemic and focused on what they had to do. And the city governments have taken responsibility, and this was really in all of the 12 cities I've talked to, that the governments, the city governments, took over the responsibility and they took over the management of the crisis, and they got, some of the cities got the support of their national governments or of their state governments, but in other cities there was no such support. So they had to organize everything by themselves without support of the national governments. Vulnerable persons and regions are most affected, especially in the global south. In Germany, for example, during the first wave of the pandemic, it was not the places where the not so wealthy people live, but almost many also wealthy people who are able to go for skiing to the Alps or are able to go for vacation to other places in the world. They were seriously affected by the pandemic, but in the global south, almost all the people in vulnerable areas and people who are not so wealthy were affected by the pandemic. There was a lack of food and fresh water, I mentioned this already, and the impacts of social distancing were also heavy impacts because they didn't have to take care of the medical side, they also had to take care of the psychological side of the pandemic because especially elderly people, but also people in the middle of their life and young people had severe problems with the social distancing, with not being able to talk to other people in person and to meet friends, and this I think is especially for elderly people who are alone, who are dependent on their family, and if you are not able to meet your family, this causes psychological diseases. Of course, wealthy cities were able to manage the pandemic much better than not so wealthy cities. So, for example, as I've mentioned, Melbourne, Singapore and Netanya in Israel are more wealthy cities. So they had the opportunities to manage the pandemic, to get the vaccines and to take care of the people. But other cities, especially in the global south, they were not able to manage everything. So they were dependent on financial support of the national or the state government and on financial support from the private sector, and not all of the cities got these financial support. I mentioned already parks, but another thing are pedestrian zones and bike lanes, because it is, of course, if you have to keep social distance from other people, to move from A to B with a bike or by walking is much less dangerous than to take a bus or a tram or any other mean of transport. And one of the outcomes of this project is that in most of the cities I've talked to, there is a higher understanding and a higher awareness of climate action and for the need of climate action and for the need of climate protection. Regarding climate change, there are big differences between the cities. It's first of all geographically. Coastal cities are much more affected than cities which are not near to a coast. Economically, the financial resources play a very important role if you want to do climate action and if you want to take climate action. And politically, I've already mentioned that there are national governments who do not take care of climate change, and we all know that there are some countries where the presidents or the heads of states they are neglecting that climate change is really happening, and that's why the cities in these states or nations do have more difficulties to do and to finance climate action than cities in other countries. Two cities of the project claim to be not seriously affected by the climate change. These are cities which are having really good variety of jobs, of companies, and which are not in a immediate coastal area, so they were not really seriously affected, but all the other cities I've talked to, they are seriously affected, and some of the cities are real frontrunners. And I don't know whether the mayor of Recife is with us here. She wanted to come, the vice mayor of Recife. I think Recife is a very good example for really good climate action and climate protection, because Recife started with climate action many years ago, and they have very good ideas and very good projects, and it's really worth to have a closer look and on what Recife has done so far. But there are other cities, of course, as well. For example, Melbourne City, and I'm talking about Melbourne City, not the metropolitan area of Melbourne. All the companies owned by Melbourne City are climate neutral today, so they are not having do not need to have a goal to be climate neutral in 2035 or 2050. They are climate neutral already today, and I think these are cities all other cities or many other cities can learn from. And there are, in all of the cities I've talked to, there are strategies for climate action. And this is also a very positive outcome of this project, that they considered how to face the climate change and what to do in their city to get the mitigation and adaptation and to reduce emissions. The impacts, I think, they are well known. Of course, we do have droughts in almost all parts of the world. We have heat waves in many parts of the world. We have to face floodings, as we have had mid-July in Germany, the heavy floodings with many people lost their lives. We do have landslides, especially in the global south, but also in Europe, and we do have the rising sea level. And I think, I don't know whether you have seen the video statement of the minister of Tuvalu, I think it was, just a couple of days ago, and he made this video statement for COP26, standing in the water, because he wanted to demonstrate that his country is seriously affected right now by the rising of the sea level. And I had in the last couple of years the opportunity to talk to many of the mayors of small island states who are seriously affected right now by the rising of the sea level. And of course, we do have a heavy impact on the biodiversity. And this is not only in the global south. If I go for a run in our forest in the city of Bonn, I do see that there is a deep impact in the forest in our country, in Germany, and I'm quite sure this will be the same in many parts of the world. Actions taken facing the climate change are, of course, action plans and strategies. These are very important. All of these are very important because we have to consider what to do and how to do it. But the difficulties I learned in this project are that there are different responsibilities. Most of the people will live in urban areas at the end of this century, and most of them are living in cities right now. And that's why I think cities have to get more responsibilities concerning their action regarding climate change. And that's why, again, special thanks to Patricia Espinosa. She was the first president of a COP who invited cities to be part of the COP. And she invited cities to the premises of the COP, to the venue of the COP, first at COP23 in Bonn. And that we are here today and are able to present what are the concerns and what are the ideas of cities is also thanks to her. So I think she's a very good supporter of our belongings, of our interests, of our city's interests. And that's why we have to take action as cities and have to take action, of course, to reduce emissions with a green model split, with renewable energy, with new bike lanes, with urban gardening, and with many other things. And we have to get a holistic approach to facing the pandemic, and we have to include health. We have to include the supply of food and water and livelihood. And we have to change our urban planning and have to consider what is important for future urban planning and land use. And another good example for really effective bike lanes is in Bogota. Bogota was not participating in our project because we had to limit the number of cities participating because of the timeline. But nevertheless, it's a very good example for very effective bike lanes because it's a bike highway next to the highway, and it's very secure, and it's crowded. You cannot see it on the photo, but I've been there for a couple of days, and it's really crowded, bike highways. And I think this is a very good example to be copied by hopefully many cities around the globe. The lessons learned during the climate change are the restrictions during the pandemic. They were very painful, the restrictions concerning transport, mobility, but they were helpful for climate protection because many cities didn't have traffic problems during the pandemic. Many cities didn't have smog during the pandemic because there was much less traffic than usual. And that's why we see and we get the result that, of course, if we have restrictions concerning, for example, the transport system, this will also protect our environment. Another lesson learned is that the medical care has to be improved because of the diseases related to climate change. We do have, because of the heat waves, we do have more heart attacks, for example. We do have more skin cancer. We do have other diseases related to the climate change because of the higher temperature. There are more insects producing diseases, and that's why I think medical care has to improve, not only facing the pandemic, but also facing the climate change. And sections of the population affected by the climate change and the pandemic are identical. That's also a thing we have learned, or I have learned doing and managing this project, that it's really the same group of people which is affected of the climate change and the pandemic, and that's why we have to have a special focus on these vulnerable people living in vulnerable areas. The financial resources must be made available regardless of political disagreements. So it cannot be an issue that if the local government, the government of the city, belongs to another party, then the head of state, that this city doesn't get the allowances or the financial means needed to take climate action or to take action facing the pandemic. This has to be regardless, and that's why the cities need to get the financial resources which are necessary to take action and to face the pandemic and to face also the climate change. And a very important issue is the supply of fresh water, because many of the cities, although there are in maybe in regions where there are not so heavy drafts, but many of the cities, they do not have the infrastructure and the possibility to supply their population with fresh water. And this is, I think, many of the cities, I asked them in the interview, which is the most important thing from your perspective, and many of the cities, or many of the persons in the cities answered that the most important thing is the supply of fresh water. And it's not only in Chennai and in Lima, for example, it's also in Recife and in other coastal areas, because with the rising of the sea level, the salt water comes into the city, into the land of the city, and the fresh water, the preparation of fresh water gets much more difficult if it's mingled up with seawater, and that's why it is really a very important thing and has to be more emphasized than in the past. And finally, the holistic city planning can mitigate the impacts, and that's why holistic city planning is very important as well. In a comparison with German cities regarding the pandemic is that the quality of healthcare and infrastructure, of course, is in Germany much better than in many cities in the global south. Also is the availability of oxygen and vaccines. The necessity of digitalization is big in Germany as well, because in some parts of our country we do not have the digital infrastructure needed for home office and homeschooling. And the vulnerability of the people living in our country is not as high as in the global south. The impacts of social distancing are also high in Germany, especially concerning elderly people, but the financial resources and economic financial resources were made available, but the economic impacts, of course, are also very heavy, but with the allowances from the federal government and the state governments, it is manageable. And so is the impacts on the livelihood are not as severe as they are in the global south. And regarding the climate change, the impacts are comparable but not as severe, although we had the heavy flooding in mid of July. Many cities in Germany have started their climate action because of Fridays for Future. And I think it is very important that especially the young people raise their voices and tell us what to do. The awareness for climate change and for climate action raised, but not of the pandemic. It was really because of Fridays for Future. We do have plans for adaptation and mitigation, and we do have the financial resources, but I think in many cities the need for the financial resources for climate action has to be to get into the heads of the responsible persons in the city councils, which is nowadays not in every city so. Sustainability strategies and climate emergency are also issues which are discussed in many of the city councils today. Transport and mobility is a big issue because we do have many cities in Germany. Bonn also belongs to these cities with traffic problems, and we have to focus on renewable energy with a much higher percentage than we have today. The challenges are that global disasters needs global solutions. I think this is a sentence we have heard quite often in the last couple of years as the sentence, think global and act local. We have to consider what we can do for other countries as well and for other cities as well. And we need efforts in all cities, regions and countries. And we do need the acceptance of the responsible persons and of the population to just do this climate action. And we do need, of course, the financial resources. We have to help other countries and other cities, and a very good example is that the city of Dortmund, for example, gave financial support and from the private sector to Quelimane in Mozambique, and so we have to cooperate on all levels, on national and international level, and of course, the motto of the 2030 agenda, leave no one behind, and that's what the United Nations try to do, especially the UNFCCC and United Nations, for example, at the Climate Week at the headquarters in New York. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attentions, and we do have a couple of minutes for your questions or your remarks on these presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashok, for your remarks. I don't know if the system in the room is in place to submit requests for questions through the buttons on the microphone, but otherwise, I would just invite you to raise your hand, and then we can see you, and you can. I see one over there. I'm just checking if there's more in the. Maybe we just start with the gentleman over there, number 30, please.
You have to switch on your micro.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Architects Robert and Brenda Vaal made the point that we should consider housing as part of our national infrastructure. Sorry, my name is Rand Boydell. I'm here as an observer for CEDA, the Scottish Ecological Design Association. Robert and Brenda Vaal, architects, made the point that we should consider housing as part of our national infrastructure for any country, on the basis that although it's sort of a consumer good, it outlives the occupants, so it's available for future generations, and also because the way our housing performs influences our energy demand, our healthcare system, all those sorts of things. So it just made me think of that and what you were talking about, that we need to fundamentally shift the way we think about our housing infrastructure from being, particularly in developed countries, purely about a personal possession, and more in terms of that it's being part of a social resource that we're managing. So just any comments on that, I suppose.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this comment. Of course, especially housing for people who are not wealthy is a very important issue, and that's why I mentioned we have to reduce the the irregular settlements in the cities and get really solid houses also for poorer people who cannot afford to rent a flat in every region of the city. And that's why we need new neighborhoods with affordable housing, with affordable flats, and the infrastructure needed to match the supplies of the people who are living there. You're absolutely right. I totally agree.
Any other questions in the room? If 36 has a question, then please, 36, you have the floor.
You have to push again, please.
Oh, another?
Yeah, now.
Can you hear me now? Good. I'm Cynthia Rosenzweig. I'm from the Urban Climate Change Research Network. We produce the assessment report on climate change in cities. We're now engaged in the third benchmark study. This is like an IPCC for cities. And so my first question is this written up and published so that we can include it in this fantastic work? And congratulations on this really, I think, very seminal and important work bringing forward the COVID and the climate change interactions and learning from that. So first, is it published so that we can include it and include the city lessons in our case study docking station, which we have also online. And then I just want to make one more point, which is something that was not included, I don't think, is the role of universities and researchers. And for cities ongoing to really form, and we held a side event yesterday on this, on the university-city partnerships, which can provide the long-term knowledge and ongoing relationships in the cities to then actually have the evidence base for all of the great, great recommendations that you're making. And I have one final very quick question. What are the two cities that said that climate change was not important to them? Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Maybe I can answer your first question about the publication. Yes, we are planning to publish the study results, but this actually is really like a pre-presentation of the results. The text has still to be finished, so we are expecting to being able to publish it at the beginning of the upcoming year. But I don't know until when would you need the data to include it?
Is good. That's good. Because our author teams, and we have one of our chapters is on this exact topic of the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change. And so early next year will be good for us to include it. So thank you very much.
Well, I will finalize the publication end of this month, but until it's published, it will be the beginning of next year. Yeah, and the other questions, yes, universities were not part of this project because we had a focus, and the Konrad Adenauer Foundation had a focus on persons who are living in the cities and engaged in climate change, and that's why, unfortunately, there were no universities on board. And the last question was which cities are not affected by climate change. The cities who said that they were not seriously affected by climate change were Pergamino in Argentina and Netanya in Israel.
Hello? Okay, now you can hear me again. So we have two questions registered. First, I registered number 4, but then number 18, you can also prepare that you will be given the floor afterwards. So number 4, you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much indeed. I was really impressed with the presentation, and it was quite interesting. I am Elisabetta Venezia from the University of Bari, and I am working on transport economics. So with regard to the lessons that we have learned, what do you think about the future? Do you think that COVID teach us something, and then in the future we will really change our habits by taking into consideration the stringency measures that we adopted and which affected our behavior by using cars and by using the different transport modes? Can we give up to some of the reasons of our mobility that we are going to use actually?
Well, I think we have learned indeed a couple of lessons, and I think that we will always remind how we were restricted during the pandemic. But I was seriously, I was surprised by seeing during the European Soccer Championship the stadiums crowded with people, and also in parts of Europe which are still heavy impacted by the pandemic. And that's why I think, and today we are having 11/11, which is a very important day in the Rhineland where I come from, because today starts Carnival. And when I see the crowds celebrating Carnival with lots of alcohol, I cannot believe that they were here or were on the earth during the last couple of months. And that's why I think we have to focus on this issue, and we have to tell the people at least once a day that we do have to change our habits and have to change a lot of things if we do not want to have a pandemic again, or if we want to manage the pandemic in another way, in a better way. And it's the same with the climate change.
Good. Number 18, and I would just like to remind everyone that this is then the last question as we're nearing the end of our session.
Hi everyone, thank you. My name is Yun Shen. I'm from a digital publication called Gov Insider. I also happen to be from Singapore, so it was quite interesting to hear the lens, from the lens of this project, the work that the government has been doing. But my question is, you mentioned that some of these cities that you spoke to didn't really get support from the national government to organize some of these things that they wanted to do. So how did they get around that lack of support?
They managed it. They managed it because they had in their budgets finances for other projects, and they just didn't do these projects and swapped the finances to projects concerning the pandemic and the climate change, and they got support from the private sector. In most of the cities, they got really big support of the private sector.
Can you hear me? Okay, sorry. So I'm afraid we've come to the end of our time today. Thank you all for your questions, and I think we need to leave the room now. So thank you all for your attendance, and thank you to Mr. Friedran and Mr. Lingenthal for the insights. Have a good continuation of your day. Thank you again.
And thank you to you, Leon, for moderating the sessions. Thanks a lot, and also from my side, thank you very much.